Alright chaps, if you watched the previous part of the series you probably knew what was coming. Yes, I'm talking about the Voodoo 3. Not that it's not in the title of the video innit, so let's stop waffling about and let's get to it. Unlike the Voodoo 1 and the Voodoo 2, which were 3D accelerators only cards, thus needed additional 2D card to work, 3D effects went the Banshee way with the Voodoo 3. The Banshee was a combination of a newly designed 2D core and a cut-down version of the Voodoo 2. It was anything but successful. It had a brilliant 2D chip but let's say the 3D bit was a disaster. Today we'll find out if the Voodoo 3 was any better. At the end of 1998, 3DFX had acquired STB systems, and instead of supplying their chips to third-party card makers as they did before, 3DFX started manufacturing their own cards under the STB name. However, there were some third-party cards, such as this one I've got. The Voodoo 3 was their first card released after the acquisition in early 1999. Speaking of third-party cards, I've got an interesting story for you. Asus, which was one of the third-party vendors, ordered a batch of Voodoo 3000s, but on the cards that arrived was printed 2000 instead of 3. Asus of course contacted 3DFX, what the bloody hell is going on, we wanted 3000s, not bloody 2000s, and 3DFX sent an explanation letter. In short, a subcontractor that was testing and labeling the cards made a mistake and instead of 3000 labeled the cards 2000. Here you can read the letter yourself. And of course the cards were not relabeled in the end. The Voodoo 3, codenamed Avenger, was more of an update than a new card. While the Banshee was a combination of a state-of-the-art 2D core and a cut-down version of the brilliant Voodoo 2, the Voodoo 3 used the same 2D core but a full-fledged Voodoo 2 with much higher clock rate. The original Voodoo 2's got 1 pixel and 2 texel chips. The cut-down version in the Banshee's got also 1 pixel chip, but instead of 2, it's got only 1 texel chip, and the Voodoo 3 included the texel chip that was missing on the Banshee. Well, nothing new so far, it seems like a recipe for another 3DFX disaster, but was it really? There were a couple of different models of the Voodoo 3. Compared to the Voodoo 2, which was clocked at 90 MHz, they were clocked at 125, 143, 166 and 183 MHz, and they were called Velocity 100, Velocity 200, Voodoo 3 1000, Voodoo 3 2000, Voodoo 3 3000, and the fastest was 3500. The Velocity cards were budget cards, costing only $75. Moreover, the Velocity 200 was never officially released. The Velocity card was clocked at 143 MHz, which was higher than the Voodoo 3 1000 for some reason, which was clocked at 125 MHz. Also, it's got only 8 MB of RAM. Thanks to that, you can't set resolution higher than 1024 by 768. Moreover, the Velocity card had second texel chip disabled for Glide and OpenGL games, so it's more like the Banshee with higher clock rate. It is, however, possible to enable the second texel chip in the Windows registry, so it should become more like the Voodoo 3 2000, which has got the same clock rate. I'm gonna test it of course if it's going to help in any way. Then we've got the Voodoo 3 3000 that was clocked at 166 MHz, and lastly the Voodoo 3 3500 was clocked at 183 MHz. Even though the Voodoo 3's got 32-bit internal texture processing, a final image is just a 16-bit color. Did anybody care? I don't think so. The only competition at the time of launch was considered the Nvidia TNT2. Unlike the Voodoo 3, the TNT2 supported 32-bit color rendering. However, not many games supported 32-bit and the TNT2 was too slow to handle it anyway. There was another card that could deter potential buyers though. 3DFX's own Voodoo 2. The Voodoo 2 by its own certainly couldn't beat the Voodoo 3 in raw performance, but 2 Voodoo 2s in SLI mode maybe could, we'll see about that. One Voodoo 2 cost $100, so I had to spend $200 for the SLI setup and at least $50 for some basic 2D card. That's basically the price for the Voodoo 3 3500. As a testing rig, I used slot 1 Pentium 3 700 MHz running on BX chipset. It was pretty much the fastest CPU you could get at the time the Voodoo 3 was launched. Of course, I need to find out how well the card does in DOS. There are not too many games for DOS that can utilize Glide, so I'm gonna try them all. To be brutally honest here, it was an absolute nightmare. To make a game work, you have to copy Glide's 2x OVL file to the game directory. You can get the file from the Windows 98 Voodoo Free driver pack, or use the latest driver most of the time. But sometimes the latest driver didn't work, so I had to use earlier one, or I had to use driver for the Banshee or even the Voodoo 2. And not only that, I had to mess about with the memory managers. Sometimes the game works with just XMS, and sometimes I had to load up EMM driver. And of course I had to combine everything with everything just to make sure the game really doesn't work. It took an eternity to test all of them. Now let's get to it in a bit of a quick fashion. And that's what you get in DOS. Even though the Voodoo 3 was supposed to have exactly the same 2D core as the Banshee but clocked higher, it's much slower for some reason. But nobody cared at this point about 2D bits of any graphics card, everybody was focused on 3D now. The Voodoo 3 has pretty much all the newest 3D features of the era, such as anti-aliasing, alpha blending, bump mapping, etc, etc. It of course supported 3D effects on Glide, OpenGL, but unfortunately only DirectX 6. There were also some sort of special ironed versions, such as this 4-processor monster from Quantum 3D called A-Alchemy. Not only it used 4 GPUs, it supported SLI through this LAN port or whatever that is. I'm not sure how many cards could be running simultaneously though. And as you may see, the card is for the PCI. The standard Voodoo 3 was released for both the AGP and the PCI slots. I tested both, and AGP didn't bring any performance advantage whatsoever. I tried changing the quality settings, but to be honest, I can't see any difference whatsoever. Now let's have a gander at some 3D benchmarks. First I'm gonna pit all my Voodoo 3s against each other. I've tried enabling second texel unit in the Velocity card if there will be some sort of performance boost. For some reason, Sin and Wolfenstein don't allow me to set higher resolution than 800 by 600 when using 3DFX driver inside the game. Except for, and this is interesting, 8MB Velocity. With this card I was able to set the resolution in Sin up to 1024 by 768, but when I enabled the second texture unit, 1024 suddenly stops working. And not only that, when I tried running the game in 800 by 600, the rig locked up every time. 640 by 480 works fine though. Sin can at least use all the available resolutions using default OpenGL driver, which is also a bit faster than 3DFX driver for some reason. As you can see, the 3500 is clearly the winner, but no surprise there. What surprised me though was the velocity. In some tests it even outperformed the 2000 series. Now let's compare the Voodoo 3 3500 to the Voodoo 2 SLI and the best card Nvidia came out with at that time, the TNT2 Ultra. The Voodoo 3 was certainly the king of single-slot graphics cards, the TNT2 was too slow to compete and other cards didn't even matter. But its reign didn't last very long. And in October, enter the GeForce. This time Nvidia probably hired better engineers and delivered a card that could dethrone 3DFX once and for all. The GeForce 256 was Nvidia's fifth card and the first one that was actually good. Moreover, they still use the name GeForce till this day, and that says something about the card. Everything was done right, excellent picture quality, 32-bit rendering, all current 3D features which include transforming lighting, fast memory and most importantly, performance. So, how did the GeForce compare to the Voodoo 3, you ask? First of all, the card I've got is not exactly GeForce, it's a Quadro based on the GeForce. It's basically the same card, except it was made primarily for CAD, it's got twice as memory and a little bit higher clock rate. Also, the Quadro was about 3 times as expensive, $300 versus $850. Basically, it was the fastest card Nvidia was offering at the time. And that pretty much concludes it. If you bought the Voodoo 3 at the time of its launch, it was the best gaming card on the market, but a couple of months later, it was absolutely annihilated by the GeForce, trampled into the ground and sadly forgotten. 3DFX didn't have an answer to the GeForce for a very long time, until they released Voodoo 5 in June next year. But the GeForce 2 was already hitting the market since May. Could the Voodoo 5 compete with the GeForce 2? We'll see next time. In terms of compatibility in DOS, the Voodoo 3 cards are less than stellar, so if the DOS gaming is your primary objective, you'd be better off with the Voodoo 2. And that's pretty much it for the video, see you next time, cheers!